The text came in at 11:47 p.m. I remember the time because I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling fan, waiting for Daniel to text me goodnight like he did every single night for the last 2 years. Instead, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi, this is going to sound insane, but I think we're married to the same man." I laughed. Actually laughed. Out loud, alone in my apartment, because it had to be a scam, a prank, some bitter ex trying to mess with my head. Then she sent a photo. It was Daniel, my Daniel, standing in a kitchen I'd never seen, in a house I didn't know existed, wearing a wedding ring on his left hand. The same ring he told me he'd stopped wearing because it reminded him of his abusive ex-wife. The same ring he told me he lost. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a homewrecker. I did not know. I would never, never knowingly do what I ended up doing to another woman. But somebody in this story is a monster, and it's not me, and it's not her. By the end of this video, you're going to watch two women who were lied to by the same man find each other, compare notes, and build something he never saw coming. Stick around, because what we did to him didn't just end his marriage, it ended his life as he knew it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, I tell real stories of betrayal, revenge, and the moment someone finally says enough. If you are one of my regulars, welcome back. You already know we're in for a ride tonight. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button because I promise you, this story gets so much worse before it gets better. There's a moment about halfway through where I found out something about this man that made me physically sick to my stomach. You do not want to miss it.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how I ended up on the phone with my boyfriend's actual wife at midnight, you need to understand how charming, how convincing, how absolutely perfect Daniel seemed when I met him. My name isn't important for this story. Call me Rachel. That's not my real name, but it's what I'll go by. I was 31 years old when I met Daniel. I'd just gotten out of a relationship that left me feeling like I wasn't worth loving, and I was cautious. I want you to know that. I was not naive. I was careful. I'd done the therapy, I'd read the books, I told myself I would never again ignore my gut just because a man was charming. That's what makes what happened so infuriating. I met Daniel at a work conference in Denver. He was there representing a logistics company. Smart, well-dressed, funny in that dry, understated way that makes you lean in to hear the rest of the joke. He bought me a drink, he asked me real questions and actually listened to the answers. He didn't talk about himself the whole night, which, if you've dated in your 30s, you know is basically a miracle. I remember the exact moment I decided I liked him. We were at the hotel bar, and I made some offhand comment about how my dad used to take me fishing every summer before he passed, and how I hadn't been fishing once since. Most guys nod and move on. Daniel stopped. He asked what kind of fish. He asked if I still had my dad's old tackle box. Small questions, but they told me he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk. We exchanged numbers. He texted me the next morning, not the "hey" 3 days later that tells you a guy's playing games, but a real message. He said he couldn't stop thinking about something I'd said about my dad. It was such a small detail. It made me feel seen. For the first 6 months, Daniel was, honestly, the best relationship I'd ever had. He called when he said he would. He remembered my coffee order, my sister's name, the fact that I hated cilantro. He sent flowers to my office on the 1-year anniversary of my dad's passing, with a card that just said, "Thinking of you today." No explanation needed because he already knew what day it was without me having to remind him. He told me he traveled a lot for work. He was a regional manager for a company that had him driving between cities for supply chain audits. That explained why he was gone 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. He'd FaceTime me from hotel rooms that all looked more or less the same. Beige walls, a Keurig, a stack of hotel towels. And I never thought twice about it, because why would I? Business travel is business travel. Looking back now, I can see it. I can see all of it. But at the time, it just seemed like he had a demanding job, and honestly, I respected that. I liked that he was ambitious. I liked that he wasn't the kind of guy who needed to be entertained every night.
Let me tell you about the good moments too, because I think it's important you understand. This wasn't some obviously hollow relationship where I should have known instantly. It felt real. It felt like love because on my end, it was. We took a trip to the Outer Banks for my birthday, and he'd planned the entire thing without me knowing a single detail. The beach house, the sunset dinner reservation, even a small gift bag with things he remembered me mentioning I liked months earlier, like a specific brand of sea salt caramel I'd only brought up once in passing. He cried at his grandmother's funeral, which I went to with him, and held my hand the entire service, like he needed me there just as much as I wanted to be there for him. Those moments were real to me. I have to believe some of them were real to him too, in whatever twisted way a man like that experiences reality. Here's red flag number 1, and I want you to really sit with this one because so many of you are going to recognize it from your own lives. Daniel never let me meet his friends. Every time I brought it up, there was a reason. His best friend just had a baby and was overwhelmed. His college buddies were all out of state. His work friends were more like coworkers than actual friends. Each excuse on its own sounded reasonable. Stacked together over a year, it was a wall. I just didn't see the wall being built brick by brick because he was building it so gently. I did meet his mother once, briefly at a restaurant, and she was warm and kind, but there was something in the way she looked at me, a flicker of hesitation before she hugged me, that I brushed off as her just being reserved. I know now that flicker was probably her trying to figure out which version of her son's life I fit into. I'll never know if she knew about Melissa. Part of me hopes she didn't. Another part of me thinks mothers usually know more than they let on. Red flag number 2. Daniel's phone had a passcode, and when it buzzed, he'd angle it away from me. Not dramatically, not suspiciously if you weren't looking for it, just a small, practiced turn of the wrist. I told myself everyone deserves privacy. I told myself I don't look through my friends' phones either, so why would this be different? There was one night, maybe 8 months in, when his phone buzzed on the nightstand while he was in the shower, and I saw a notification preview flash across the lock screen. Just a few words, something like, "Pick up the twins at 4." I remember standing there, staring at it, feeling this cold little drop in my stomach. When he came out of the bathroom, I asked him about it, trying to sound casual. He said it was a group text from his sister about her kids, that he must have been CC'd by accident on a family thread. I believed him. I actually believed him because the alternative was too big to imagine. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, whoever's watching this. If you've caught yourself making excuses for someone's secrecy, writing a whole defense brief in your head for behavior that made your stomach twist, that instinct, that little twist, that's information. We moved in together after 14 months. It felt like the natural next step. He said his lease was ending and it just made sense for him to move into my place, since I owned it and he was between apartments anyway. Another thing that seemed small at the time, another brick in a wall I couldn't see the shape of yet. Of course his lease was ending, or never existed at all. His real home was 2 hours away, with a mortgage in his name, a wife, and 2 kids waiting for him to walk through the door. Living together, some things got harder to explain, like the 2 separate phones. He said one was for work, compliance reasons, he called it, since his company handled sensitive shipping manifests. I didn't know enough about logistics to know that wasn't really a thing. Why would I? I trusted him. He'd leave the work phone locked in the glove box of his car sometimes, or in a small combination lock box in his closet that he told me held his late father's watch collection. I never once thought to ask why a watch box needed a phone charger running into it. There was a weekend, about a year into living together, when he told me he had to go to Ohio for a site audit. He was gone Thursday to Monday. When he came back, he had a sunburn. Ohio in November. I asked him about it, half joking, and he laughed and said the warehouse had bad ventilation and they'd been outside doing inventory in the loading yard. I let it go. Another time, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket while doing laundry, a children's clothing store. 2 items, sizes that clearly weren't for any kid I knew of in his life. When I asked, he said it was a gift for his coworker's daughter, some office baby shower thing. I didn't push. Why would a grown man lie about buying a birthday gift for a coworker's kid? It seemed like such a strange, pointless thing to lie about, which is exactly why it worked. Small, oddly specific lies are so much more believable than big, obvious ones. I let a lot of things go, because here's the thing nobody tells you about being lied to by someone who's good at it. It doesn't feel like being lied to. It feels like slowly, gently being taught not to trust your own instincts. Every question I had, he had an answer ready, smooth, reasonable, slightly annoyed that I'd even asked, like I was the unreasonable one for wondering. He had this way of sighing, just slightly before he answered, like I was exhausting him with my suspicion, and it worked every single time to make me feel like the paranoid one in the relationship. That's called gaslighting, by the way. I didn't have that word for it back then. I do now. About 18 months into living together, he proposed. We were on a hiking trail we'd gone to on our second date, and he'd somehow arranged for a friend, someone I'd still never met, interestingly enough, to hide behind a tree with a speaker playing a song that had been our song since the beginning. Small ring, big speech, the whole thing. I said yes. I remember calling my mom crying happy tears in my car in a Target parking lot. I remember thinking, finally, my life is falling into place. We started planning a wedding for the following fall. He kept pushing back on venues, saying his work travel made it hard to commit to a date. Every time I found a venue I loved, there was a scheduling conflict, a big audit coming up, a reason we needed to wait just a little longer to lock anything in. I thought he was just stressed about money, or maybe cold feet, which I told myself was normal. In hindsight, he was buying time. He was managing 2 women's timelines like 2 separate accounts, and every delay in my wedding planning was probably him juggling something with her, an anniversary, a school event, a family vacation that couldn't move. There was even a moment, about 2 months before everything fell apart, where I brought up eloping instead, just going to the courthouse ourselves, since the big wedding planning had stalled out so many times. He got strangely tense about that idea, more tense than the topic warranted, and quickly redirected the conversation to how he wanted to do it right and give me the wedding I deserved. Of course he didn't want us at a courthouse. A courthouse pulls records. A courthouse would have surfaced, in about 4 seconds of searching, the fact that he already had a marriage license on file with the state. There's one more thing from this period I need to tell you about, because at the time it felt like nothing, and now it feels like the loudest warning bell I ever ignored. About 3 weeks before that text from Melissa came through, I was going through Daniel's laundry. Nothing suspicious, just doing a normal load of wash, and I found a receipt in the pocket of one of his jackets. A pediatrician's office, 2 children's names on it, partially smudged from the wash cycle, but I could make out enough. I remember standing in my laundry room holding that receipt, feeling something cold and unnamed settle in my stomach. When I asked him about it that night, he barely missed a beat. He said it was his sister's kids, that he'd picked them up from an appointment as a favor since she was stuck at work, and that the pediatrician's office must have printed him a copy of the visit summary, out of habit.
It was such a specific, boring, plausible explanation that I actually felt embarrassed for asking. I remember apologizing to him for being suspicious. He told me it was fine, that he understood why I'd want to ask, and then he made us dinner like nothing had happened. I think about that night constantly now, because those weren't his sister's kids. Those were his kids, his actual children, with Melissa, and he'd sat across from me at our kitchen table that same night, eating pasta he'd made from scratch, while I apologized to him for asking a completely reasonable question about a receipt with his own kids' names on it. That's the level of comfort this man had with lying. It wasn't panic, it wasn't stammering, it was dinner and a smile. Because here's what I didn't know yet, and what you're about to find out with me. Daniel wasn't dating someone else on the side.
He was married to someone else. Had been the entire time I knew him, and she had no idea about me either. We were both the other woman, and neither of us knew the other existed, because there was no other woman. There were two real relationships, two real homes, two women who thought they had a whole man, when really they each had exactly half a liar. But what happened next, I never saw coming. So let's go back to that text message, 11:47 p.m., a stranger's number, a photo of my fiancé in a kitchen that wasn't ours. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely type. I wrote back, "Who is this?" 3 little dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Whoever this was, she was choosing her words as carefully as I was choosing mine, both of us standing at the edge of something neither of us wanted to fall into, but both already sensed was true. She responded almost instantly, like she'd been staring at her phone too, working up the courage to send that first message. Her name was Melissa. She told me she'd been married to Daniel for 6 years. 6 years! Longer than I'd even known him. I remember reading that number over and over. 6 years. Not 6 months, not recently separated. 6 years of an active, ongoing, legally binding marriage, running in parallel to my entire relationship with this man, like 2 train tracks that never should have crossed, but somehow, impossibly, had. She said she found me because Daniel's phone had synced to a family iPad by accident, a photo backup glitch, and my face showed up in his camera roll under an album labeled WorkConf 2023. Except the pictures weren't from a conference, they were from a weekend trip we'd taken to Charleston. One of them was me asleep on his shoulder on the plane, a caption underneath that just said a red heart emoji. She told me she'd sat at her kitchen table for almost 2 hours that night, just scrolling, unable to stop, unable to look away, the way you can't look away from a car accident even when every part of you wants to. Photo after photo, me at dinner, me at the beach, me laughing at something off camera, clearly comfortable, clearly in love, clearly having absolutely no idea I was living inside someone else's marriage. She said she almost threw up when she saw it. Then she found more. Restaurant receipts on a card she didn't recognize, a second phone bill hidden in a drawer in the garage, addressed to a P.O. box, a gym membership in a town 2 hours away, where, it turned out, he kept an apartment. My apartment. Our home. The one I thought was ours and only ours. She said the worst part, worse even than the photos, was realizing how calm he'd been at dinner just 3 nights earlier. He'd sat across from her at their kitchen table, helped their son with a math worksheet, kissed her on the forehead before bed, and the entire time he'd known exactly what was in that camera roll, exactly what he was risking, and he hadn't flinched once. That's the part that told her, and later told me, that we weren't dealing with someone who'd made a mistake. We were dealing with someone who had built an entire operating system for lying, and it ran so smoothly he barely had to think about it anymore. I asked her to prove it. I know that sounds cold, but I needed to. I needed this to be a mistake. She sent me a photo of their marriage certificate, date, county courthouse, his full legal name, middle name and all, a middle name he told me his parents never really used, so he didn't either. She sent me a photo of the two of them at what was clearly a wedding, him in a tux, her in white, both of them younger, both of them so happy it made my chest cave in. I want to tell you about the moment it actually hit me, because up until that photo, some tiny, stupid, hopeful part of my brain was still building an excuse for him. Twins, identity theft, something, anything other than the truth. I actually typed out and deleted a message asking if he had a brother he'd never mentioned. That's how badly I wanted an off-ramp from what was staring me in the face. The truth was staring at me in a JPEG, a younger, thinner Daniel, hair a little longer, arm around a woman in a wedding dress, both of them mid-laugh at some joke I'd never know the punchline to, at a wedding I never knew happened, to a man I thought I was going to marry in 4 months. I sat on my bathroom floor, I don't even remember walking there, and I called Melissa. Not texted, called. She picked up on the first ring. We were both crying so hard neither of us could get full sentences out for the first few minutes. Two strangers sobbing together over a phone line, grieving the same man, the same lie at the same time. At one point, she asked me, through tears, does he still do that thing where he hums when he's brushing his teeth? And I said yes, and we both just kind of laughed, cried at the absurdity of it. Two women who'd never met, who now knew more intimate details about the same man's daily habits than either of us had realized, comparing notes like we were piecing together a puzzle of a person who apparently didn't fully exist as one whole human being anywhere. And here's the moment where the rage really settled in, for both of us. We started comparing timelines. Melissa had been married to him for 6 years. I had been with him for almost 3, which meant for the entire time Daniel and I were together, meeting my parents, getting engaged, planning a wedding, he had a wife, a house, a life. He wasn't cheating on her with me casually. He had built an entire second marriage on paper trails and lies around an existing one. We went line by line through our calendars, comparing dates like 2 detectives working the same cold case. The weekend he told me he was in Ohio for that site audit, Melissa checked her own calendar and found he'd told her he was at a work retreat in a different state entirely that same weekend. Neither story was true. He'd actually been somewhere else altogether. We'd later find out where, and it would turn out to be even worse than either of us imagined. The anniversary of our first date, the one he always made such a big deal about, taking me somewhere new and thoughtful every single year. Melissa told me that same week, every year, was also the week of their wedding anniversary, and he'd always find some excuse, a work emergency, a last-minute audit, to celebrate with her a few days late, quietly, without the fanfare he saved for me. I got the real celebration, she got the leftovers. Neither of us got the truth. And it got worse. Melissa told me about the kids. 2 kids, 7 and 4 years old, a boy and a girl. Every single business trip Daniel had taken to see me, every anniversary dinner, every weekend getaway, those were nights he was gone from his own children. Nights Melissa handled bedtime alone, thinking her husband was grinding it out on the road for their family, when he was actually lying in bed with me watching Netflix, planning a wedding he had no legal right to have. She told me their daughter, the 4-year-old, had a nightly ritual where she wasn't allowed to fall asleep until her dad called to say goodnight, even from the road. Melissa said sometimes those calls came late, sometimes he sounded distracted, sometimes she could hear a television in the background that didn't sound like a hotel television at all. I felt something in my chest crack open when she told me that, because I remembered those calls. I remembered being right there next to him on the couch, half paying attention to whatever we were watching, while he checked in with the office, which I now understood was him saying goodnight to a little girl who had no idea her father was lying to her, too, in his own small way, every single night. I remember screaming into a pillow so my neighbors wouldn't hear me. I remember feeling this specific, nauseating shame, even though I did nothing wrong, even though I had no idea, because some primal part of me still felt like a woman who'd hurt another woman's family. Melissa, to her enormous credit, stopped me right there. She said, "Don't you dare apologize to me. You're a victim in this too. He did this, not you." I want to sit with that for a second, because I think a lot of you watching have felt some version of that misplaced guilt, feeling responsible for a betrayal you never orchestrated, never knew about, never would have chosen if you'd had the facts. That guilt doesn't belong to you. It belongs entirely to the person who lied. Melissa understood that instantly, and it was one of the things that made me trust her so fast. She wasn't looking for someone to blame, she was looking for the truth, same as me. That's when we found out about the money. Melissa had noticed, over the past year, that their joint savings, money meant for their kids' college funds, had been quietly draining. Daniel told her he'd moved it into a better investment account, and that the paperwork was still processing. When she pushed him on it, he got defensive, told her she didn't understand finance and to just trust him. Classic. Textbook. I recognized the tone immediately because he'd used almost identical words on me when I'd asked why our joint wedding fund was $6,000 short the month before. He'd told me it was a temporary cash flow issue related to a work bonus that hadn't cleared yet and that he'd make up the difference the following month. I believed him, obviously, because I had no reason not to. I didn't even know there was a her for that money to be quietly funneled toward. Same man, same script. 2 different women, 2 different homes, one financial black hole in the middle draining both of us dry. We stayed on the phone until nearly 4 a.m. At some point, exhaustion took over, and the conversation slowed into something quieter. Not just shock anymore, but a strange, unexpected kind of solidarity. Melissa told me she kept waiting to feel jealous of me, or angry at me specifically, and she said the feeling never came. "You're not the enemy," she said. "You're just the other person he did this to." I told her I felt the exact same way about her. Somewhere around 3 a.m., one of us, I honestly don't remember which, said out loud what we were both already thinking. This couldn't just end with a breakup and a slammed door. By the end of that call, something had shifted in both of us. The grief was still there, it would be there for a long time, but underneath it, something colder and clearer was forming. Melissa said, very quietly, very calmly, "I want to see his face when he realizes we found each other." And I said, "I want more than that. I want him to lose everything, the same way he made both of us lose our sense of reality." We didn't confront him that night. We agreed on that immediately, without even having to discuss it much. If we confronted him right then, he'd do what men like Daniel always do. He'd panic, spin a story, pit us against each other, disappear the evidence, maybe disappear himself. We needed him to have no idea we knew anything. I want to be honest about how hard that decision was to sit with. Every instinct in my body wanted to call him right then, at 4 a.m, and scream every single thing I now knew directly into his face. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the gut punch I'd just felt. But Melissa, who'd clearly had more time that night to think it through than I had, talked me down. Gently. She said something that stuck with me. If we react now, we're doing this on his terms, in his timeline, with him still holding all the cards. If we wait, we get to choose when this happens, and how, and with what proof in our hands. Let's not give him the easy version of this. She was right, obviously, but that didn't make the following days any easier. So for the next several days, I did something that took every ounce of strength I had. I texted him good morning, like normal. I asked about his trip. I let him believe nothing had changed. I laughed at a joke he texted me about his coworker's terrible coffee order, and I hated myself a little bit for how normal my voice sounded when he called that night and I answered like everything was fine. There was a moment, about 4 days into this pretending, when he FaceTimed me and told me he loved me, completely unprompted, in that easy, casual way he always had. I remember sitting there, phone in hand, looking at his face on my screen, thinking about Melissa's kids asleep in a house I'd never seen, thinking about the receipt with children's names on it that I'd apologized for even questioning, and I said it back to him anyway. Love you too. 2 words that used to mean everything and now tasted like ash in my mouth. But I said them because the plan needed me to. That's the part of this story that still sits heaviest with me, honestly. Not the discovery itself, but those days of pretending afterward. Knowing what I knew and still having to smile through a phone call. I don't think people talk enough about how much strength that takes. It's easy to imagine yourself screaming the truth the second you find out. It's a completely different thing to sit on that truth, silently, strategically, for the sake of a bigger outcome. Because Melissa and I had already started planning something that would make sure Daniel didn't just lose one relationship. He was going to lose the version of himself he'd spent years building. The reliable husband, the loving fiancé, the trustworthy coworker, the good son, the reputation, the money, all of it in one coordinated collapse, timed so perfectly he wouldn't see a single piece of it coming until it was already over. But what happened next, even I didn't expect, because it turned out Daniel's lies went even deeper than either of us realized. The next morning, Melissa sent me something that changed the entire scope of what we were dealing with. She'd gone through Daniel's home office while he was at work, quotation marks very much intended, and found a folder tucked behind old tax documents. Inside were printed bank statements for an account neither of us knew existed, an account that had been receiving transfers from both of our households for over a year. Not huge amounts. Each time, 500 here, 800 there, small enough that neither of us questioned it individually, but added together, it was over $40,000. We didn't know yet where that money was going. That became priority number 1. I want to walk you through exactly how we built this plan because I know a lot of you watching have been betrayed before, and I want you to see that revenge doesn't have to mean doing something illegal or something you'll regret. It means being smarter, calmer, and more patient than the person who lied to you. Step 1. Documentation. Melissa and I created a shared encrypted folder. Every text message, every bank statement, every photo, every inconsistency in his story, all of it went in there, time-stamped and organized. We weren't just building a case to confront him with. We were building a case for lawyers, for banks, potentially for a fraud investigation, because taking joint marital funds and funneling them into a hidden account to fund an entire second relationship, that's not just a moral crime. Depending on how it was done, that could be actual financial fraud. We even built a shared spreadsheet. I know that sounds almost funny given the circumstances, 2 heartbroken women color-coding a document at 2 in the morning, but it kept us grounded. 1 tab for dates, 1 tab for financial discrepancies, 1 tab, which we only half-jokingly titled Lies He Told, where we tracked every excuse he'd ever given either of us that we now knew, side by side, could not both be true. Reading that tab back was almost surreal. The same man had told 2 different, specific, detailed lies about the same missing weekend, the same missing money, the same missing hours, and neither of us had ever had a reason to compare notes until now. Step 2. The bank trace. Melissa had access to their joint accounts as a co-owner, which meant she had every legal right to request full statement histories going back years. She requested them quietly through the bank's app, no red flags raised. What we found was staggering. Daniel had opened the mystery account under a slight variation of his name, middle name first, last name legal, at a totally different bank than either of our households used. He'd been the only signer, and the money in it wasn't just sitting there. Some of it had gone toward a third rented property, a studio apartment under a corporate LLC he'd registered in a town equidistant between Melissa's house and mine. We sat with that for a long minute on our call, both of us doing the same silent math. A third property meant either he was preparing an exit strategy, somewhere to disappear to once one of his lies inevitably came undone, or, and this was the possibility neither of us wanted to say out loud first, there was someone else entirely, a third woman who had no idea any of this was happening either. Melissa broke the silence. "We need to find out who else he's doing this to," she said, "because if there's a pattern this well built, I don't think we're the only two." She was right. I want to tell you about the people who helped us get through this, because we didn't do this entirely alone, and I think it's important for anyone watching this who's going through something similar to know that you don't have to carry something like this by yourself. I told my sister everything, about a week into all of this, once I trusted myself to say it out loud without falling apart completely. She dropped everything. Genuinely, she took 2 days off work and drove 4 hours to stay with me. She sat with me while I went through old photos and messages, helping me flag inconsistencies I was too emotionally close to see clearly myself. She's the one who actually caught the detail about the sunburn in November, cross-referencing an old text where he'd complained about cold, miserable warehouse audits that same week, a full contradiction I'd never noticed because I hadn't been looking for contradictions back then. I'd just been living my life, trusting the person in it. Melissa had a close friend from college, a woman named Denise, who worked adjacent to the legal field and helped translate some of the more confusing financial paperwork for us in plain English before we ever brought any of it to an attorney. Denise was the one who first flagged that the LLC's registration documents listed a registered agent address that didn't match anywhere Daniel had ever claimed to live, which became one of the key threads that helped us pull on the whole third property discovery. None of us were investigators. None of us had any special training in this. We were just 3 ordinary women, plus a sister, plus a friend, pooling together whatever skills and instincts we each had, refusing to let this man's lies stay buried simply because untangling them felt overwhelming. If there's one thing I'd want anyone in a similar situation to take from this part of the story, it's that you are allowed to ask for help. You don't have to carry the weight of unraveling someone else's deception completely alone. I remember Melissa's voice cracking when she told me this part. "Rachel," she said, "I don't think it's just us. I think there might be someone else." That sentence changed everything. Step 3, finding out if there was a third woman. This is the part where I need you to understand something about revenge done right. It's not just about anger, it's about information. We didn't want to blow up his life based on assumptions. We wanted facts. So we did something simple and completely legal. We watched. Melissa knew his work schedule better than anyone, since she'd been managing his calendar unknowingly for years. Years through shared family accounts, she noticed a recurring audit trip every other Wednesday to that same town where the LLC's studio apartment was registered. I want to be clear here because this matters. What we did next wasn't stalking, wasn't harassment, wasn't anything that crossed a legal line. We sat in public places. We watched a man come and go from a building in broad daylight. Anyone can do that. We just happened to have a very specific reason to. I drove out there myself on one of those Wednesdays. I told my coworkers I had a dentist appointment. I sat in a coffee shop across the street with a good zoom lens on my phone and I waited, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold, watching the door of that building like it owed me something. 2 hours passed. I remember thinking halfway through that maybe I'd built this whole theory up in my head, that maybe this really was just some innocent rental property, that maybe I was chasing a ghost because some part of me needed there to be a bigger villain than just my fiancé is a liar. At 6:40 p.m., Daniel pulled up in his car. Same car I'd ridden in 100 times, same rattle in the front left door he always meant to get fixed and never did. My stomach dropped the second I saw it turn the corner. And a woman came out of that building to meet him. Attractive, maybe late 20s, comfortable with him in a way that told me this wasn't a first date. She was wearing one of his old college hoodies. I recognized it instantly because it used to hang in the back of our closet before it went missing in the wash about a year ago. They hugged like people who'd done this 100 times. He kissed her on the forehead the exact same way he used to kiss mine. I sat in that coffee shop and watched my entire relationship get reduced to a rerun playing out in front of a stranger's apartment, and something in me went very, very quiet and very, very cold. Her name, we later learned, was Priya, and no, she was not married to him. She had no idea he was married to anyone at all. He'd told her he was divorced, that his ex-wife had kept the kids and turned them against him, and that he was slowly rebuilding trust with people after a painful divorce. 3 women, 3 separate identities of himself, each one custom-built for the person in front of him. To me, the busy, traveling professional who lost his wedding ring. To Melissa, the devoted husband managing a demanding job. To Priya, the wounded, divorced dad trying to heal. He wasn't just cheating, he was running an entire second and third life like a business with 3 separate branches, and none of the branches knew the others existed. Here's where the plan sharpened into something real. Melissa reached out to Priya the same way she'd reached out to me. Carefully, gently, with proof attached so there'd be no doubt. She sent a short message first, just enough to get her attention, then followed up with the photo of the marriage certificate, the same one that had broken my heart a week earlier. Priya called Melissa within minutes. From what Melissa told me, the call started with disbelief, moved into hysterical crying, and ended with a kind of hardened resolve I was starting to recognize as the natural 3rd stage of finding out you'd been living inside someone's lie. Priya had been telling her friends and family for months that she'd finally found a good one, a man who understood, better than most, what it was like to be burned by a bad marriage. She'd defended him to a skeptical sister. She'd started apartment hunting near his place so they could eventually move in together. All of it built on a divorce that had never happened, because there was no divorce. There was just us. But underneath the devastation, she was furious and she wanted in. Now there were 3 of us. I think it's worth pausing here to say something about what this could have looked like, and so often does in stories like this. It would have been easy for 3 women in our position to turn on each other, to feel some twisted, misplaced competition, to let Daniel's lies do exactly what they were built to do, which was keep every woman in his life isolated, never comparing notes, never trusting anyone but him. The moment the 3 of us got on a call together, that entire structure collapsed. We weren't rivals, we were witnesses to the same crime, each holding a different piece of the evidence, and together, for the first time, we could see the whole picture, clearer, colder, and far more damning than any one of us could have seen alone. There was one moment during this planning phase that almost blew the whole thing wide open before we were ready, a near miss that still makes my stomach clench a little thinking about it. About 2 weeks before the Denver trip, Daniel called me out of the nowhere in the middle of a weekday, which he almost never did. He sounded strange, a little too casual, a little too chatty, asking me odd questions about whether I'd talked to anyone new lately, whether I'd been getting any weird calls or messages. I now believe Melissa's phone must have briefly synced something to a shared device again, or he noticed a discrepancy in an account somewhere, and some instinct in him sensed the walls were closing in, even if he didn't have proof yet. I remember my heart absolutely pounding through that entire phone call, terrified he somehow already knew, terrified I'd say the wrong thing and tip our hand before we were ready. I kept my voice light. I told him no, nothing weird, just work stuff, the usual. He seemed to relax a little by the end of the call, but Melissa and I agreed afterward that it was too close for comfort. We accelerated our timeline by about a week specifically because of that call, worried that if we waited any longer, he might get spooked enough to disappear the evidence, or disappear altogether. Step 4. The timing. We decided the reveal needed to happen all at once, in a way Daniel could not spin, could not manipulate, and could not escape from. We picked a date, his upcoming work conference in Denver, the same city where he'd met me 3 years earlier, which felt almost poetic if it wasn't so infuriating. We knew from the calendar pattern that this conference was actually a weekend he'd carved out to spend 2 nights with me and 1 night with Priya, all while telling Melissa he'd be gone for quarterly audits. We booked the same hotel, different rooms, but same building, same weekend. Step 5. Legal groundwork. Before we did anything dramatic, Melissa met with a family law attorney, quietly, on her lunch break, telling no one, not even her sister, who she usually told everything. The attorney listened to the whole story without a single flicker of surprise, which honestly told Melissa something on its own. Apparently, this kind of thing is far more common than any of us wanted to believe. The attorney confirmed that moving joint marital funds into a hidden account, especially to fund what looked like a pattern of ongoing deception with financial elements, could absolutely be used in divorce proceedings and, depending on how the LLC was structured, could open him up to further scrutiny, possibly even from the bank itself if the account had been opened using misrepresented information. She started gathering documentation for a fault-based divorce filing that would maximize her settlement and custody protections, timed to file the Monday after our Denver weekend. The attorney was very clear about one thing: timing mattered enormously. Filed too early, and Daniel would have time to move money, hire a good lawyer, and get ahead of the narrative. File right after he'd been caught red-handed with 3 corroborating witnesses and a mountain of financial paperwork already gathered, he wouldn't have a single move left to make. I met with my own attorney too, since we'd been engaged, cohabitating, and I'd contributed to shared expenses under false pretenses. Turns out there were real legal remedies available to me as well for financial deception in a domestic partnership, especially since some of what I'd contributed toward our wedding fund had, we now believed, been quietly siphoned toward that 3rd rented apartment. Priya, since she and Daniel weren't married, cohabitating, or financially entangled in the same formal way, didn't have the same legal options Melissa and I did. But she had something just as valuable. She was a completely uninvolved, unbiased third party who could corroborate the entire pattern of deception from a totally separate angle, which mattered enormously for how believable this whole thing would look to anyone outside the 3 of us, including, eventually, Daniel's employer. We weren't going to break any laws. We were going to use every single legal tool available to make sure Daniel faced the full weight of consequences for what he'd built. The night before the Denver trip, all 3 of us got on a video call: Rachel, Melissa, Priya, 3 women who should have been strangers to each other, sitting there like a small, furious war council, laptops propped up on kitchen counters and bedroom desks in 3 different towns, united by the same face on all our screens whenever we pulled up a photo of him. We went over every detail: who would be where, what we'd say, what evidence we had ready to hand over and to whom. We rehearsed it almost like a script, honestly, not because we wanted it to feel theatrical, but because we knew Daniel would try to talk his way out of it the second he had an opening, and we needed to make sure none of us gave him one. Priya, who'd been quieter for the most of the earlier calls, spoke up near the end of that final planning session. She said something that stuck with both Melissa and me for a long time afterward. She said, "I keep thinking about how much time I spent defending him to people who loved me. My sister told me something felt off about him, and I got so mad at her for saying it. I think part of why I want to be there tomorrow is for her, so she knows I finally saw it too." Melissa looked at the screen and said something I'll never forget. Tomorrow, he thinks he's juggling 3 separate lives. By Sunday night, he's going to realize he built a house of cards in front of the only 3 people who could ever tear it all down at once. I remember closing my laptop that night and sitting in the dark for a long time, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not sadness, not rage, but something steadier. Certainty, maybe. The certainty that whatever happened tomorrow, we were finally the ones holding all the information, and he had absolutely no idea. But even we didn't fully know how dramatically this was about to unravel, because Daniel had one more secret left, and it was about to blow this whole thing wide open. Friday afternoon, Daniel texted me that he'd landed in Denver and checked into the hotel. Same routine as always. Same text he always sent. "Made it, room 412. Miss you already." Like nothing in the world had changed. Like he had no idea his entire architecture of lies was about to crumble down around him in under 24 hours. I told him I'd meet him there Saturday, after a work thing ran long. A lie, obviously, but for the first time in this relationship, I felt no guilt about it whatsoever. What he didn't know, Melissa had flown in Friday morning and was already checked into a room 2 floors above his. Priya arrived Friday evening and checked in on the floor below. 3 women, 1 building, 1 clueless man in the middle floor, completely unaware his entire world had already surrounded him before he'd even ordered room service. I remember texting the group chat the 3 of us had created. We'd named it, half jokingly, half not, the Truth Squad, once I landed. Melissa sent back a single message. "He's currently down in the hotel bar ordering a drink like a man without a single care in the world. Let's give him one more good night's sleep before tomorrow." There was something almost merciful in that, honestly. One last quiet night before everything he'd built came apart. Saturday morning, Melissa knocked on his hotel room door at 8 a.m. She told me later she'd stood in the hallway for almost a full minute before she did it, going over everything one more time in her head, steadying her breathing the way you would before stepping into cold water. Then she knocked. I wasn't in the room, obviously, but she recorded the conversation, which, in a one-party consent state like the one they were in, was completely legal and something her attorney had specifically advised her to do in case she needed it for the divorce filing. She told me later that his face went white, not confused, white like a man who instantly knew exactly what this meant and had no story ready for the first time, maybe ever. His mouth actually opened and closed once, no sound coming out, before he found any words at all. He tried anyway. He said, "Melissa, baby, I can explain. This isn't what it looks like." She cut him off and said one sentence, "I know about Rachel, and I know about Priya." Melissa said his whole body seemed to sag against the doorframe, like whatever was holding him upright for the last 6 years had just been switched off. He tried again, weaker this time. "It's not, I was going to tell you, I was figuring out how to tell you." She didn't let him finish that sentence either. "You had 6 years, she said. "You had 6 years to figure out how to tell me. Instead, you had a wedding with a woman you can't even legally marry, and a whole second apartment for a woman who thinks you're divorced, so don't you dare tell me you were figuring it out." That's when I knocked on the door too. I remember my hand was steady, which surprised me, given how badly it had shaken the night I first got Melissa's text. And when he opened it wider, stunned, already reeling from Melissa's presence alone, Priya was standing right behind me in the hallway, arms crossed, jaw set, looking every bit as furious as I felt. 3 women, 1 doorway, a man who built his entire adult life on the bet that we would never, ever find each other. I want to be honest with you, this wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't dramatic in the way you'd expect from a movie. It was worse for him than that. It was quiet, cold, methodical. Melissa spoke first, calm as anything, and told him she'd already filed for divorce that Friday morning before her flight, and that her attorney had copies of the hidden account statements, the LLC paperwork, and the recording of this exact conversation. I told him I'd already spoken to my attorney about recovering the money I'd put toward our apartment and our wedding, money that had actually been funding his double life. I remember my voice not shaking at all, which felt like its own small victory after weeks of feeling like I might fall apart at any moment. I told him the ring was in the mail back to whatever jeweler he'd bought it from, because I didn't want a single object connected to him in my apartment anymore. Priya, who honestly had the least reason of any of us to stay calm since she'd been completely unaware she was even part of an affair, looked him dead in the eye and said, "You told me your ex-wife kept you from your kids. You don't have an ex-wife. You have a wife right now who you're still married to, standing right there." She pointed at Melissa without breaking eye contact with him. "You made me feel sorry for you. Do you understand how sick that is?" Daniel didn't have a script for this. For the first time in years, there was no smooth answer, no reasonable explanation, no gaslighting angle that could possibly work on three women standing shoulder to shoulder with a folder of evidence between them. He looked, in that moment, smaller than I'd ever seen him, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. He tried anger next when the shock wore off, tried to flip it, saying we'd ambushed him, that this was humiliating, that we had no right to gang up on him like this, as though the three of us organizing was somehow the crime, rather than the years of coordinated deception that made our organizing necessary in the first place. Melissa, without raising her voice even slightly, told him humiliation was what happens when the truth catches up to a lie, and that he'd had 6 years, 3 years, and 8 months, respectively, to be honest with any one of us, and he chose not to be. Every single day, every single phone call, every single "I love you" that came out of his mouth while he was building this entire structure of deceit. He tried one more angle, the saddest one, honestly. He looked at me specifically and said, quieter now, almost pleading, "Rachel, what we had was real. You know it was real." And I remember feeling something settle in me, something almost calm when I answered him. I said, "Maybe some of it was real to you, but you can't build something real on a foundation that's entirely fake. I don't know which parts to believe anymore, and honestly, neither do you. You don't even know who you actually are with any of us." He didn't have a response to that. For once, he was completely out of words. We didn't stay much longer after that. There wasn't a dramatic exit, no slammed door, no final speech. Melissa simply told him she'd be in touch through her attorney and that he should not contact her directly outside of matters concerning the kids. Priya told him not to contact her at all, full stop. I didn't say anything else. I just turned and walked down that hallway, with Priya on one side of me and Melissa a step behind. And I remember feeling for the first time in months like I was walking toward something instead of away from it. We ended up in Melissa's hotel room afterward, the three of us sitting on the edge of a bed that wasn't even hers, in a city none of us particularly cared about, processing what had just happened. Nobody cried, oddly enough. I think we'd all done enough of that already in the weeks leading up to this moment. Instead, we ordered room service, cheap hotel wine, and something that felt almost like relief settled over the room. Priya was the one who finally said it out loud. I think that's the first time in months I've felt like I could breathe. We spent that afternoon going over next steps together, making sure everyone knew exactly what paperwork needed to happen and when, making sure nobody was navigating the aftermath of this alone. That, I think, ended up being one of the most important parts of this entire story. Not just the confrontation itself, but the fact that none of us walked away from that hotel and went back to processing this in isolation. We'd built something in the middle of all that wreckage, a strange, unexpected sisterhood that none of us asked for, but all three of us needed. Here's what happened in the weeks that followed, because the hotel room confrontation was really just the opening move. Melissa's divorce moved forward with the financial documentation already prepared. Because of the hidden account and the clear pattern of diverting marital funds, her attorney was able to negotiate a settlement that gave her the family home outright, full custody of their 2 children with generous child support, and a portion of Daniel's retirement account as compensation for the misappropriated funds. Daniel tried, at first, to fight the settlement, to claim the hidden account was some kind of misunderstanding, some innocent business venture he'd meant to tell her about eventually. But with the recorded confrontation, the LLC paperwork, and 2 additional witnesses corroborating the same pattern of behavior across overlapping timelines, his attorney reportedly advised him within the first week that fighting this in court would be a losing and expensive battle. He settled. Daniel's employer, it turned out, had a strict conflict of interest and conduct policy, and when it came out that he'd registered a business LLC using company time and travel days to fund it, alongside some irregularities in his expense reports that matched suspiciously with his audit trip schedule, an internal review was opened. It didn't take long. Within 3 weeks, he was quietly let go. No severance, no goodbye party, just a box of his desk items shipped to his apartment and a termination letter citing violation of company conduct policy. His professional reputation in that regional logistics industry, a smaller world than you'd think, where everyone seems to know someone who knows someone, took a serious hit once word got around. And it got around fast.
I heard secondhand through someone who used to work with him that at his exit meeting, he tried to frame the whole thing as personal matters that had nothing to do with his job performance, and that his old manager reportedly cut him off and said something along the lines of using company travel days and expense accounts to fund a secret apartment is a job performance issue. I don't know if that story is exactly accurate. It came through 2 or 3 people by the time it reached me, but I like to imagine it happened exactly like that. I pursued a civil claim for the money I'd contributed towards shared expenses and wedding costs under false pretenses of an actual legal engagement, since he was already married and legally could not have entered into that engagement in good faith, and had knowingly let me spend thousands of dollars planning a wedding that could never legally happen. My attorney called it one of the more straightforward cases she'd handled in a while, since the paper trail alone told almost the entire story. I recovered a significant portion of what I'd lost, though, of course, no amount of money undoes the years, or the version of my future I'd built in my head that never actually existed. Priya, understandably shaken by how thoroughly she'd been deceived, chose not to pursue anything legal since she hadn't lost shared finances the way Melissa and I had. But she did one thing that I think was maybe the most satisfying twist in this entire story. She was, it turned out, incredibly plugged into local community groups, the kind of small-town adjacent Facebook and networking circles that Daniel's new job hunt would eventually run right into, since he tried to stay in the same regional industry rather than start over somewhere new. When a potential new employer posted in a local professional networking group asking if anyone had feedback on a candidate, Daniel, for a regional manager role, it didn't take long for accurate, publicly available information to surface. Divorce filings are public record. Court documents are public record. Once someone knew where to look, the pattern was right there in black and white for anyone doing basic due diligence on a job candidate. Small towns talk. Small industries talk even more. The twist that really got me, though, came about 4 months after all of this. Melissa called me. We'd stayed close, by the way, genuinely close. The kind of bond you don't expect to form with someone in this situation, but that ends up being one of the realest friendships of your life.
and she told me Daniel had reached out to her, trying to get back into the kids' lives more, trying to rebuild some kind of image, painting himself in his messages to her as a man who'd made a series of mistakes and deserved a chance to make things right slowly. And in trying to explain himself to his own children someday, he'd apparently told his lawyer during a custody mediation session that he never meant for it to become this many people, as if the number of women he was lying to was the moral failure rather than the lying itself. Melissa said she almost laughed out loud in the mediation room when the mediator relayed that line back to her. Even at the very end, faced with the total collapse of every relationship he'd built on lies, he still didn't fully get it. He wasn't sorry he'd lied. He was sorry the math had finally caught up to him. That's when I knew, for certain, we hadn't just gotten revenge, we'd shown him a mirror he was never going to be able to look away from again. And unlike every other mirror in his life up to that point, this one, finally, he couldn't talk his way around. It's been almost 2 years since that night on my bathroom floor, crying to a stranger on the phone who turned out to be one of the strongest women I've ever known. I want to leave you with something, because I know a lot of you watching have been in some version of this. Maybe not 3 women in a hotel hallway, but that same gut-drop feeling of realizing someone you trusted built a life around lying to you. Here's what I learned. The red flags were always there, not because I was stupid. I want to be so clear about that because so many of you blame yourselves the way I did at first, but because someone who's good at lying makes those red flags feel reasonable, one at a time. Trust your gut. If something feels like it needs a defense you're building in your own head, that's worth paying attention to. A healthy relationship doesn't require you to constantly explain away your own discomfort. And here's the other thing. Revenge doesn't have to mean burning your own life down to make someone else's collapse. The most powerful thing Melissa, Priya, and I ever did wasn't yelling in that hotel hallway. It was staying calm, staying organized, and letting the truth, documented, time-stamped, undeniable, do the damage on its own. We didn't have to make anything up. We didn't have to exaggerate a single detail. The truth, rayed out clearly and calmly, was more devastating to him than any amount of screaming ever could have been. Melissa's thriving now, by the way. Her kids are doing great, bright, funny, resilient in the way kids so often are. She started her own small business this past spring, something she always wanted to do, but Daniel used to talk her out of, telling her it was too risky. Funny coming from him. Priya moved to a new city about a year ago for a job opportunity she said she probably wouldn't have taken if she hadn't gone through all of this, since it forced her to reevaluate what she actually wanted out of her own life instead of building it around someone else's. I'm doing well too, still cautious in dating, but no longer afraid of my own instincts. If anything, I trust them more now than I ever did before. I think about those 2 little kids sometimes too. They're not part of this story in the way Daniel was, and I'll never pretend to know what their experience of all this has been or will be as they get older, but I hope, more than anything, that they grow up seeing their mom as the strong, clear-headed woman who handled an impossible situation with more grace and strategy than most people could manage. I hope they never have to know the details, and if they ever do, I hope they know their mother wasn't the one who built the lie, she's the one who tore it down. So here's my question for you, and I really want to know. If you found out you were the other woman and there was actually a wife number 2 or even a number 3, what would you have done? Would you have confronted him immediately or built the case the way we did? Would you have been able to sit on that truth for weeks, pretending nothing had changed if it meant a better outcome in the end? Comment below and let me know. I read every single one. And if this story kept you here till the end, if you felt that rage, that shock, that final satisfaction when the truth finally caught up to him, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got a lot more stories like this one coming, and trust me, some of them get even wilder than this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.